Hello and welcome to part 2 of Remove Module Basics. I'm Product Manager Martin Brennand, and in this section we're going to go in more depth with the tools that will help you get the most out of removing objects in Mocha Pro. In part 1 we covered a standard workflow where you need to remove an object and you've got some background to work with. So let's take a quick look at what we did in part 1. So to recap, here we have Steve, we've done a little mask around him in the shot, and we're telling Mocha this is the area we want to remove. We then have a background shape here. If we just click the background example, we've got this section which is telling Mocha this is the area we want to remove with. So we've got our fish, remove this, we've got our background, remove with this. So that's the main concept behind the remove module. So this was a fairly simple shot, and if we just turn off our mats for a second, we can see our final remove here. And we can see here it's done a nice clean job, and there's not much else that we need to do here. Now we've also got some other foreground objects here, and I highly recommend you go back and see part 1 to see how all this comes together. But basically these foreground objects are telling Mocha don't use these areas when you're doing the remove. So now that we've done this section, we're going to look at something a little bit more difficult. Steve was quite easy to remove, but this time we're going to look at Kevin. Now Kevin is not so simple. Kevin is staying in one spot, he's always covering part of the background, and he's kind of just floating a little bit and not really doing anything. And this becomes a lot more difficult to remove because we don't have available background to work with. So how do we remove a fish like Kevin? Well, in this instance we have to use some clean plates. But first off, let's try and see how much of Kevin we can actually remove. Okay, so I've started with a clean project just so that we can see what's going on. And the first thing we're going to do is exactly what we did last time. I'm going to do a simple mask around Kevin here. So let's just draw a basic shape around Kevin. And we're going to have to modify this a little bit because he's got some fins coming into this shot that we'll need to adjust. So I'm just going to make this a little bit wider. And the first thing I'm going to do is just track this through. I'm just going to use shear, rotation, scale, and translation. And we'll start tracking that forwards. So here we're getting a reasonably good capture of Kevin, and you can see some fins coming out the side here that we're going to have to modify in the shot. And we're going to throw off a little bit as we come off here, and he disappears off the shot as it grabs onto some of this coral down here, and that's fine, we can just adjust that later. Okay, so we've got our little track done, and it's done a reasonable job, but we're going to have to do a little bit of tweaking now. So let's just come to the end of the shot. We'll just zoom out here a bit. Let's just find where it was going okay for a while there. Let's just set a little keyframe on that one there, and let's just come to the end of the shot now. I'm going to turn on my transform tool, and let's just quickly adjust to fit where that needs to go around his body. And we'll just quickly go through and do this. We'll find the other areas so we can see the fins coming out here, so we need to make sure we capture those fins as well. Again, I'm not being super accurate with this, I'm just getting as much information to cover him as possible. So we're going to have to go through here and make sure we're finding every part of him. So we can see a little bit of soft edge coming through there, where that fin is coming through, and again his fin is coming through here. So we'll just keep on tweaking that. So all we're doing is making sure that we completely cover him through the entire shot. So we're just going to come down here, we can see a little bit more there, and here. Now a good way to visualize this is actually to use the matte tool. So I'm going to come up here and turn on the matte, and I'm going to turn off the colorize tool so that it cuts him out. Now this will help to see if anything's sleeking out the edge, but an even better way to do this is actually to invert your matte. So I'm going to come down to invert, and this will actually punch a hole in our footage and we can see a little bit better. So I'm actually going to turn off my splines so we can see that, and I'm actually also going to turn off the tangents. So we're just going to see the selected tangent, and this is going to be a lot easier for us to see. So let's just zoom in a little bit, and we'll start looking through here. So we can just see here, immediately we can see a little bit of Kevin peeking out there, so I'm going to move it over there, and again over here. So we're just making sure we cover all of those areas. We can see one a little bit more here. So I'm just going to speed up the recording now, and we're going to tweak those final bits, and then we'll come back when we're done. So I'm going to turn off my invert now, and we'll just make sure in this view that he's completely covered. And as he comes off the edge there, we're looking pretty okay. So once we've got our mask done, we can now go ahead and do the background track. So I'm going to turn back on my colorize layer, and I'll turn off the matte in this instance, and let's just turn back on those splines as well so we can see our original mask. So now we can go ahead and do the background. So let's just start drawing that now. Okay, so I've just zoomed out and we're going to start drawing behind this remove layer now. So I'm going to select my X-spline and we're going to make a fairly large shape. We want to make sure that we cover all of the area that Kevin is going to be sitting behind. And I'm going to come all the way up to about here. And this will probably be about the right size. So I'm going to move my layer below my foreground layer because we need to make sure that our background is actually below what we want to remove in the stack. So I'm going to call this one background. And I'm going to leave the settings almost the same. I'm going to up my minimum percentage of pixels. I'm going to change that to 90. But I'm going to leave this just as sheer rotation, scale, and translation, mainly because the background is far enough away that perspective is probably not going to matter too much. If there was a large perspective change, I would definitely want to have perspective, but in this case, I think I'll be okay. The camera move is slight enough that sheer will do the job for us. So I'm going to go ahead and start tracking this now. If we turn on our track mats, we can see that our foreground object is covering our background, so it's going to ignore this foreground area when we do the track. So let's start tracking. So as we go through this, we're just going to quickly make sure that this fish won't interfere. If we'd kept those masks from the previous example, that wouldn't be a problem because it's going to avoid any area that this has been masked out, but here will probably be okay. We can see him coming in a little bit here. Now remember, when you're using the planar tracker, you can stop the track at any point to avoid stuff like this. So I'm just going to move my spline up a little bit so that he doesn't interfere with that area, and we'll just keep on tracking forwards. So as he comes down here, he's going to be completely avoiding that area. And we can see his tail starting to kick up here, so I'm just going to move that up a little bit further. And he'll be totally fine from there. So we're going to keep on tracking this through. And as we start to get down here, we're starting to lose a little bit more information, so I'm just going to push this down a little bit further. And that's going to track through quite nicely. So let's just quickly turn on our grid and make sure we've got an okay track. So that's looking pretty solid. You can see the shape animating because I've moved that around, but you can see that if you look at the grid, it's very, very solid, and more importantly, the shape is completely covering Kevin in our shot. So we could actually go back and actually remove the rest of these keys if we wanted to, because they're a little bit distracting, so I'm just going to go back and delete them. And again, this is not going to affect the track or the remove because we're just clearing out search area information that we'd used while we were tracking. So now that we've got this shape, you can see that the shape is following on correctly still, and we've got a very good track for that background remove. So I'm just going to turn off that grid, and now we can go over to the remove tool and look at how much of Kevin we can actually get rid of. So let's come down and click on remove. And let's select our foreground layer that we need to remove with. So we're going to turn off the mats and let's just start rendering forwards and see how much we can actually get rid of. So I'm going to render. So as you can see, we're not actually getting rid of the fish that much. And the reason for this is because he's always sitting right in front of the background we need to remove him with. So what we're going to need to do, and I'll just stop this render, is we're going to have to manually create some background to work with. We're going to have to actually invent some background because we never see behind him. And the way we do this is we create a clean plate. So using this exact frame, where I've actually taken some of him out already, I'm going to come down to the clean plate clip area and just click create. And what this has done is it's created a clean plate, and I'll just drag out this so we can see. It's created a clean plate clip in my results directory and assigned it to the frame number that I created it on. And if we're working in stereo, we can also choose whether it's a left or right view, but here we're working in a mono clip, so it just has a mono dropdown. So I need to go now and open this up in my paint program of choice. Most people this is going to be Photoshop, but you can use what you like. And I'll just quickly take you through that clean plate process. Okay, so here we are inside Photoshop, and we've got our clean plate already loaded from that results folder. Now, I'm not going to go through an extensive clean plate process here in the tutorial. I will just speed up what I do here, but we're just basically going to be using some clone tools, some paint tools, and so on and so forth. You can see here too that the remove process has not quite got the lighting right on this frame, so we'll be addressing that later in the tutorial using the illumination tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint this whole area out and make sure it fits the rest of the scene. So we're going to do a little bit of creativity here just to patch that in, but you can watch the process as we speed through it now. Okay, so I've got my final result here, and if we just turn off the layer, we can see the difference there. So you're going to see we've done a little bit of creativity just to make this fit. It's not perfect, but it'll do for this example. So obviously you'd be much more meticulous in creating the right environment here, but we're pretty lucky here because we've got a fairly kind of bobbly, blurry environment, and it's looking pretty okay. So I'm happy with that, and I'm going to bring that now back over to Mocha. So first of all, I'm just going to flatten this layer. Let's flatten that down. I'm going to save it, and now that will automatically be referred back to Mocha. So let's go back over to Mocha and take a look at what we do next. Okay, so back over in Mocha, we still have our clean plate here. So this is exactly the same one we just saved from Photoshop. You don't need to go and reload it or anything. It'll just read from what you've saved. So I'm just going to click OK. And now we can go ahead and start looking at using that clean plate in our shot. So the first thing we can see down here is the Use Clean Plates Exclusively button. And this is great for when you need to only use the clean plates rather than other data in the shot. And we're probably going to end up using that here, but this is also great for things like where you don't actually have any background to work with, such as when you need to remove something like a blemish or a tattoo or anything that has no physical background behind it, but we're actually going to replace it with a clean plate. And the reason we want to do this is that often it's easier to use this remove tool to blend in these kind of remove patches when, rather than doing it through, say, like export of a tracking patch and then matting it out in another compositing application. The remove module handles that patching process really well, so this Use Clean Plates Exclusively button is really handy for that. The other thing the Use Clean Plates Exclusively checkbox is great for is speeding up the process. If you're sort of cut for time, and you often are, this will actually only reference those clean plates, and that really speeds up the processing of the remove. If you're actually doing a complete scan of the shot and not using exclusively clean plates, what you're going to get is a much longer render time because it has to analyze the entire shot to find usable data. So that's another great reason to use the clean plates exclusively. But if you've got a lot of good stuff in there, it's often better to use maybe a one clean plate and then the rest of the shot to help out. And clean plates are often used where there's just not usable data in a particular section of the shot. So there's many different ways to use this. And in this example, we're using it in that exact example where there just isn't background available. So we're going to actually check that one on. And then we're going to look at our illumination modeling. So by default, illumination modeling is set to none, and this is the fastest way to do remove. All this is going to use is the existing data in the shot, whether you're using a clean plate or just other tracked background in that shot. And this is definitely the one we recommend to start with in the process. When you're actually doing a remove, if you're starting to use any of the other illumination modeling tools, it's going to slow down your process because there's a lot of calculation that needs to get done to make sure that lighting matches. So always start with none to begin with and just see how your render looks. And we're going to try that now. So I'm going to come down here and actually start rendering forwards, and we'll see what this patch is actually going to do. So let's just start rendering. So as we go through this, it's not actually looking that bad, but let's just have a look as we come down. We'll let it render out for a bit, and you can see this is actually rendering quite fast. It's actually rendering about the same speed as how we tracked before, because it's doing sort of a direct comparison and quickly removing that object. So I'm just going to press stop there, and let's have a look quickly at what we've got. I'm just going to hide my layers here. immediately you can see a problem here. You can see this large artifact around the edge of our patch. And this is because the lighting is not quite matching up to the original shot. And we can see a few little problems there. So the reason now we need to use illumination modeling is to avoid this obvious patching issue. Now there's one other thing we can do here before we go into that, and that is to actually help blend it. So let's just undo the render in all the frames. So we're back to square one, and I'm going to turn back on those layers. So one thing we can do is actually try and blend this. Now in versions before 4.0.1 you can use the blend tools here to actually do this. So I'll select blend here, and then I can ramp up a dissolve width which will actually blend the patch out a little bit on either edge, and that can help there. Alternatively, in Mocha Pro 4.0.1 we're now supporting the actual layer matte edge width. So I select my entire area here, the points. We can go ahead and use the edge width tool to actually expand that out a little bit, and that's probably about enough, maybe a little bit more. So we've got this feathering now. If we turn on our patch here, we can see that feathered matte, and this feathered matte will now be used as the blending in the shot rather than this. You can still use the dissolve blending in the remove tool here, but you've also got now the option of using the edge width in 4.0.1. So I'm going to start rendering that one again, and you'll see that it helps a little bit. Let's just turn off those layers again so we can see. Let's start rendering forwards. So you can see that blend is actually working a lot better, but we can still see some patching problems here. And we check back on this one. Let's just go here. Now you can see I've made a classic mistake here. You can see that I haven't actually set Uber key on for my edge width. When you set an edge width, it is a per point keyframe thing. So I'm just going to quickly undo that. Let's just undo that edge width that we just did. Actually, the quicker way to do it is just to set edge width to 0. And I'm going to turn on my Uber key this time. Always useful to turn on your Uber key when doing this kind of work, because if you're doing adjustments across the whole frame, the Uber key is going to apply that change across all the keyframes, not just the keyframe you're on. And that's a really, really handy way to work. In fact, I recommend when you're doing any of the remove module tweaks to have that Uber key on until you're happy with the result. Because if you start switching around illumination modeling to test, this box here is also keyframed. So if you set none here and then down the track you go, oh, let's try linear or interpolated data, it will actually have a keyframe between those points. So it's good to keep Uber key on while just testing out what you're going to do next. So I'm going to actually now do that again. Let's set our edge width to, let's try just 10. We'll add a few more there. So that'll probably do about there. Maybe one more. We'll keep that patch like that. So again, we've got that matte now. And now if we scrub, we can see that that's actually applying across the whole time. So let's just try that again. I'm going to undo my render in all keyframes. I always recommend using undo render in all frames first. The reason for this is that when you do a remove render, you're actually applying the render back to the render you've just done every time you re-render. So it's always good to undo the render first before you start again. So that way you're not compiling the render on top. So we'll just make sure that's undone. Okay, so let's turn off the mattes and the layers again. And let's show you again with just illumination modeling set to none how that looks. So we'll start rendering forwards. So you can see we're getting a much better result this time. The blend is working quite well, and we're not getting any real problems in the change of that data in this background. So we'll just keep on rendering here and we'll go through, and we can see it's doing pretty well. You can just see some problems just starting to come up on this edge here, but this actually may be a background issue. So let's check that now once we've finished this render. So I'm just going to stop it there, and let's actually take a look. So yeah, we can see a little bit of a patch problem there. So I'm going to turn back on my layers and just see if that's to do with how the background is tracked, because we may be able to fix this problem without doing any illumination rendering. So let's turn those layers back on. So let's just go back to where we were seeing that artifact problem. I'll just check where that is so we can start to see it coming in here. And we can see here there is exactly that problem. We've got this background and it's actually cutting into the blend of our foreground shape. So we're actually getting a hard edge where there's no more usable background to work with. So all we need to do now is actually expand our background a little. So I'm going to select that, and we're still in Uber key mode, so this means that we can actually modify our points of the background without animating it over time. So I'm just going to push it out to about here, and we'll bring it down a little bit down here as well. So now that we've got a bigger shape, we can probably go ahead and do this again. So I'm going to actually, once again, just to make sure, I'm going to undo render in all frames. Oops, helps if I select my foreground layer. Undo render in all frames. And we'll go back to the beginning of the shot. And again, I'm going to turn off those layers. And let's start rendering again with that new background shape done. So we're, again, getting a good blend here with that original blend shape we did. So what we're going to get now is that original background shape, if we look at that, that is now covering a larger area, and so we shouldn't get that little blend issue now when we come to this part of the shot, because that background is now covering the right area. And we can see we're getting a lot better result here now. Just like so. So we'll just let that render out, and let's talk about illumination modeling. So I'm just going to zoom that back to full. So let's just play that back. I'm going to press play. So we can see we can get in quite a good result now. We've still got the nice moving coral around the edges here, and it looks like it's actually patching in quite well with that blend. So let's just quickly talk about the illumination modeling and what we've done here. So under the illumination modeling, we have our three options. We've got none, linear, and interpolate. Now, we've just used none here, and we always recommend starting with none because that's going to be the quickest option. Because we're not doing any additional calculation, we're actually analysing the shot, finding the best places to use, and then applying the remove. Or we're using the data we've been given by the clean plates. So that's definitely the fastest way to do it. But if you have any significant kind of lighting change in the area you're trying to remove, you'll need to use one of either the linear or interpolated illumination models. So let's just quickly talk about linear and interpolate. So a linear move is where there's any kind of lighting change that happens over time. So if you've got an actor's face that you're trying to remove something off the side of, and their face turns left to right to actually hit the sun or any kind of other light, that is a linear move. Their face is turning from left to right, and you can see a significant lighting change happening on their skin. Another thing is such as the camera moving to a lighting source where there's actually some kind of gamma shift or aperture change going on in the shot. So there's many different ways that a linear progression can happen. It's an obvious change of light happening over time in the shot. So that's the best time to use linear. And linear is faster than interpolated mode, but it will be slower than the none mode because it is still working out a lighting change. In this particular instance, we don't have that. We've got sort of kind of caustic type light going on in the shot, so the linear change won't actually provide much of an effect for this kind of shot. So finally, let's talk about interpolated mode. So interpolated mode is a method of illumination modeling where it looks at the lighting happening on the frame you're on and the frames around it. This is a great way of handling things like flickering light, any kind of random lighting going on, or things like shadows passing over shots and things like that. So it's different from the linear mode, which works out a progression of light. This is actually working out light per frame and seeing how to reapply it in that shot. Now, interpolated mode is quite a processor-intensive version of the rendering process, so keep that in mind when you're planning out your shots. For example, if it's quicker for you to paint 2 clean plates rather than using the interpolated mode, have a think about whether or not that's better for you rather than doing the interpolated render. In most cases, when you're using clean plates, it's still reasonably quick. And let's take a quick look at that. I'm going to undo my render in all frames once again. And we'll come right to the beginning, and I'm going to use interpolated rendering this time. So we'll start rendering this forwards. So in this particular mode, we can see that the render's a little bit slower because we're only using a single clean plate to work out our remove. If we were using all the frames, it might be a bit slower than this. So the initial frame takes a little while to analyze because it has to work out how it's going to be moving, but after that it speeds up just a little bit. So now we're rendering, we can see that the patch is still going well, and we're getting some subtle color changes now because it's trying to work out how that light is matching the frame that we're removing into. And we'll show a comparison after this is done. So what I'm going to do is actually speed up the recording now, and so we can see the rest of the render, and we'll come back when we're done. Okay, so now that's done, let's take a quick look at the final result. So we can see that it's done a pretty good patch job compared to the none patch we did, but the changes are not that noticeable except for some subtle color changes. So what we're going to do is just quickly go over to After Effects so you can see those changes side by side. So I'm going to switch over to After Effects now and we'll take a look at those renders. Okay, so here we are in After Effects, and I've got the 3 renders done from Mocha. I've got the none, I've got the linear, and I've got the interpolated removes. So we're just going to have a quick run through and see how these look. So we've got the none remove, and that patch has done very, very well, and we can probably go with this one because again it's a sort of nice, simple, flat, blurry area in the back of the shot, and we're not really noticing that much of a problem here or any major artifacts going on here. If we look at the linear mode, we can actually see it actually degrades it a little bit. If we pan through the shot here, we can see some problems cropping up at the top of our image here, where that linear change has tried to accommodate, and we get some sort of nasty artifacting here. And so this is a result of Mocha trying to look for a linear progression and not getting the result we need. So this is one of the drawbacks if you use a mode that may not be suited to the type of shot you're working with. So keep those in mind when you're thinking about your illumination modeling. Finally, we'll have a look at the interpolated mode. And the interpolated mode is pretty much just a subtle color change. You can see here it's almost the same as the none view, and if we go back to the none view, we'll just pan through this shot and we'll see. So you can see a subtle color change and lighting change happening there, and it just adds a little bit to it. So if we go to difference mode in our none render, so it is over the top of our interpolated render, you can see, if we scrub through the timeline, that the changes are purely in a lighting and color area in the shot. So you can see how that just adds a little bit more subtlety to the original remove by adding that additional lighting to the shot. And this is a very, very soft example. If we were to use a more extreme example where there was much more erratic lighting, these changes would be much, much more noticeable. So that wraps it up for part 2 of Remove Module Basics. We will be having a part 3, which will go into multipass rendering and dealing with multiple backgrounds. If you've got any questions, please do go to the forums at imagineersystems.com. You'll find those forums under the support menu. This has been Martin Brennand, Product Manager for Imagineer Systems.